The Kremlin's golden halls gleamed under hundreds of crystal chandeliers, their light reflecting off marble floors polished to a mirror sheen. Outside, a biting November wind whipped through the streets of Moscow, rattling iron grates and carrying the distant echo of trams clanging along frozen rails. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, almost suffocating, as high-ranking officials gathered around the massive oak table in the Senate chamber. Maps of Europe were spread across its surface, each dotted with colored pins marking pipelines, borders, and strategic energy hubs. Russia's vast network of gas supplies, once a quiet backbone of influence, now shimmered in the minds of those in the room as a potent instrument of power. Faces were lit by the cold green glow of digital screens, each displaying graphs of consumption, alternative supply routes, and European energy dependencies. At the head of the table, a senior Kremlin advisor cleared his throat. His words were deliberate, slow, carrying the weight of consequence. Finland, he said, pointing to the northern section of the map, relies on us more than they realize. If we cut the gas, the message will be clear. The room was silent except for the soft hum of heaters struggling against the cold winter air and the occasional shuffle of papers. Some officials leaned forward, eager to affirm the move. Others reclined, uneasy, sensing the potential fallout. One general, his uniform adorned with decades of service, muttered under his breath, "We risk more than just a blackout." Outside, the city seemed oblivious to the storm brewing within the walls. Streetlights flickered over snow-covered cobblestones. Cars moved slowly, their engines rattling, leaving trails of exhaust into the frigid air. News crews stationed near the Kremlin's gates speculated endlessly about an announcement that had yet to be made, unaware of the weighty decision being finalized inside. Finally, the advisor's words sliced through the tension. "It is decided. The pipeline will be closed, effective immediately." A collective nod circled the room. Phones clicked off. Papers were stacked neatly. Moscow's cold winter wind, now stronger, seemed almost to echo the gravity of the moment. Outside, the city continued, unaware, while inside, the wheels of geopolitics had shifted irreversibly, setting Europe on the brink of an energy storm. Helsinki woke to a gray, frozen dawn. Snow lay heavy on the streets, pressed down by the weight of trams and trucks, turning sidewalks into icy slabs. The city's usual hum was muted, broken only by the distant wail of sirens, and the occasional scrape of a shovel against asphalt. Streetlights flickered dimly, struggling against the sudden drain on electricity, while apartment windows glowed weakly, a faint reminder of warmth fading. Inside the Finnish Ministry of Energy, Minister Alexander Stubb sat alone in his office. The room smelled faintly of coffee and tension. His fingers drummed against the polished mahogany desk as he stared at the screens in front of him, flowcharts of pipelines, consumption graphs, and blinking alerts that screamed of crisis. Every figure told the same story. Russia had closed the pipeline, and Finland's energy reserves were dangerously low. Outside his window, the city moved in quiet urgency. Factory chimneys puffed smoke in fits and starts, some already shutting down due to the lack of gas. Families in high-rise apartments huddled around small electric heaters, blankets drawn over shoulders, their breath fogging the air. Children in schools were told to stay indoors, and businesses were forced to stagger working hours. Stubbs' mind raced. Each option seemed worse than the last. Emergency imports could cover only a fraction of demand. Coal reserves were dwindling, and the wind turbines, spinning against the icy gusts, were insufficient for the scale of need. The political pressure was immense, the public's anxiety palpable. A single misstep could send the nation into panic. In the streets, people whispered rumors that Russia had intentionally cut the supply to assert dominance. That winter would be longer and colder than ever. The uncertainty was suffocating. Stubb felt the weight of it all pressing down, not just as a politician, but as a human watching lives teeter on the brink. Hours passed and the cold deepened. The city's emergency lights cast long shadows on snow-dusted streets, painting a picture of isolation. And yet, amid the despair, small acts of resilience appeared. Neighbors sharing heaters, volunteers delivering blankets, and small cafes offering hot tea to those shivering outside. The crisis had begun, not just as a political move, but as a test of endurance and spirit. And while Moscow's decision rippled through the Baltic, in Helsinki, every flickering light and every Shivering citizen became a silent witness to a war waged in the chill of winter, one where energy was both weapon and lifeline. Far to the east, deep in the frozen expanse of Siberia, the gas control facility stood like a fortress against the winter. Snowdrifts pressed against steel walls, and the wind screamed through narrow gaps in the concrete, sounding almost like a distant warning. Inside, the facility was eerily quiet except for the constant hum of machinery and the soft beeping of control panels. Ivan Petrov, a middle-aged technician, sat in the dim glow of his monitors, his breath fogging the cold air inside the control room. The screens were alive with data, pressures, flows, and pipeline integrity readings. One message blinked insistently. Directive from Moscow. Cease all gas flow to Finland immediately. The words were cold, bureaucratic, absolute. Ivan rubbed his temples. He had spent decades working on this network, ensuring steady supply across Russia and beyond. Now the very system he had helped maintain was being turned into a weapon. He thought of his sister living just across the border, her apartment heated by the very gas he now had orders to stop. The human cost gnawed at him, deeper than the Siberian frost ever could. Outside, the night was unbroken darkness. The wind rattled metal roofing and whipped the snow into blinding drifts. Every so often, the howl of a lone wolf echoed across the tundra, a reminder of isolation and survival. Ivan's fingers hovered over the control panel, torn between obedience and conscience. He imagined families in Finland shivering under blankets, waiting for heat that would no longer come. The decision from Moscow left no room for discussion, yet Ivan found himself hesitating. Duty to the state had been drilled into him since his youth, but so had a sense of humanity, of moral responsibility. He checked the gauges again. A tiny reroute was technically possible, enough to keep a handful of homes warm without alerting Central Command. It would be risky. If caught, he could face consequences severe enough to make him a cautionary tale. Finally, Ivan made a choice. With trembling hands, he initiated a controlled trickle of gas along a secondary line, carefully monitoring the pressure and flow. The meter stabilized. For a few homes at least, the night would not be unbearable. Outside, the Siberian wind continued its relentless howl. But inside the small control room, a quiet warmth lingered, not just from the machines, but from a human act of defiance. In the cold heart of Russia, Ivan had found a sliver of conscience amid the machinery of power, reminding himself that even in geopolitical games, one person could still make a difference. The wind across northern Europe had grown sharper, carrying the first heavy snows of winter. In Moscow, the Kremlin basked in the glow of political victory. Televisions replayed the announcement over and over. Analysts praised the strategic maneuver, and ministers exchanged nods of approval. The halls of power were warm, quiet, and insulated from the chaos their decision had unleashed. Outside, the city moved in its usual rhythm, trams clanging, pedestrians bundled against frost, and street vendors bracing for the cold. Meanwhile, in Helsinki, the city adapted to the harsh reality. Citizens huddled in dimly lit apartments, offices worked under staggered schedules, and emergency services responded to frozen pipes and failing heaters. Families shared blankets and hot tea, murmuring over the news reports. Russia had closed the gas pipeline. Minister Stubbs' office, still lit by a single desk lamp, felt suffocating. He stared at the flowcharts, imagining the faces of those enduring the cold. Each blinking icon on his screen represented a life chilled by circumstance beyond his control. Far to the east in Siberia, Ivan Petrov watched his control panels with quiet satisfaction. The meters indicated a steady, controlled flow of gas rerouted along secondary lines, only a fraction of what Moscow had cut, but enough to keep several households warm. His sister's apartment was among them. The act was small, invisible, almost insignificant in the grand geopolitical chessboard, but it was human. Ivan knew the consequences if discovered, yet he felt a flicker of triumph. In the heart of the frozen tundra, he had defied bureaucracy and kept warmth alive. News began to trickle across social media. Reports of isolated households in Finland, maintaining heat despite the shutdown. Analysts and journalists speculated, theories spreading like wildfire. Meanwhile, ordinary people shared stories of neighbors helping one another, of local communities improvising to survive. The political headlines screamed of conflict and power. But the human narrative quietly persisted. Resilience, compassion, and connection crossing borders. In a world dictated by strategies and pipelines, one small act of conscience had created a ripple of warmth across the cold expanse. Moscow claimed victory, Helsinki faced a winter crisis, and in Siberia a lone technician smiled at the glow of a heater, knowing that sometimes humanity mattered more than politics. Across the frozen north, the echoes of this quiet rebellion whispered the same lesson. Even in the midst of power struggles, life and empathy could persist, flickering like a candle against the darkness.